Have you ever watched your husband propose to another woman, his own boss, right in front of 200 people at your wedding anniversary? I have. And what he didn't know is that I came prepared, with the documents that took everything back. If you're a woman over 40 who's ever felt like you're going crazy, who's been told you're paranoid for noticing things that don't add up, this story is for you. Before I tell you how it all unfolded, make sure you hit subscribe. These aren't just stories, they're lessons in betrayal, survival, and power you don't want to miss. The birthday that shattered everything. My 30th birthday was supposed to be unforgettable, and it was, but not for the reasons I had imagined. The ballroom glittered with golden lights, the kind you only see in magazines. Crystal chandeliers caught every sparkle, champagne flutes clinked in rhythm, and the room was buzzing with warmth and laughter. I had spared no detail in planning the celebration. From the violin quartet tucked neatly in the corner, to the three-tier cake crowned with roses, to the custom photo wall where guests lined up to immortalize the evening. I stood at the center of it all, draped in an emerald silk gown that hugged me just right, a glass of champagne in one hand and my husband David's fingers in the other. At least, that was the picture we painted. To everyone watching, we were the couple people envied, beautiful, successful, and standing at the helm of a $350 million company we built together. But I had learned that even the most flawless pictures have cracks. And sometimes, those cracks split open in the most public of ways. Here's what I wish someone had told me years earlier. When you're busy being the perfect wife, you miss the warning signs. You ignore the gut feelings that scream something's wrong. You make excuses for behavior that deep down, you know isn't right. You convince yourself that love means trusting blindly, even when the evidence suggests you shouldn't. David's best friend, Mark, had been unusually quiet all evening. Normally, he was the life of every gathering, loud jokes, bear hugs, and the type of laughter that turned heads. But tonight, he sat stiffly at our table, swirling his drink, eyes sharp as if he were keeping score. Every time David leaned in to whisper something to him, I noticed Mark's jaw tighten. His shoulders would stiffen, his grip on his glass would tighten, and he'd look away with an expression I couldn't quite read. I dismissed it at first. Not everything needed a story. Or so I thought. But looking back, Mark was wrestling with something that had been eating at him for months. Knowledge that was burning a hole through his friendship with David, loyalty battling against conscience. There had always been whispers, small rumors I tried to ignore, of a faceless woman in David's life. Late-night meetings that ran until 2 a.m., with explanations that grew increasingly elaborate. Unexplained absences where his story would change slightly each time I asked about it. Hurried phone calls that would end abruptly when I entered the room, followed by casual explanations that never quite made sense. Credit card charges for restaurants I'd never been to, jewelry I'd never received, hotel rooms booked during supposed business trips that didn't align with his calendar. When I asked, he'd kiss my forehead with that indulgent smile and call me paranoid. You're being insecure, sweetheart. You know I only have eyes for you. And I believed him. Because that's what good wives do, right? We trust. We believe. We swallow our doubts and apologize for being suspicious. We ignore that voice in our heads screaming that something is wrong because we've been taught that questioning our husbands means we don't trust them, and not trusting them makes us bad wives. The first sign something was about to explode came when David clinked his glass, the sharp crystal ringing cutting through conversations across the room. The music lowered, heads turned, and conversations gradually died down as people realized the host was about to speak. He flashed me that perfect smile he had always used to disarm me, the one that had made me fall in love with him years ago. That practice charm that could make investors open their wallets, make women at parties hang on his every word, make me forget why I'd been upset about something just moments before. To my beautiful wife, he said, his voice steady and theatrical, projecting to reach the back tables where our business partners and clients sat watching. 30 never looked this good. Cheers erupted around us like a wave. Glasses raised, faces beamed, and someone started clapping. I laughed, my cheeks warming with the attention and champagne, and leaned in to kiss his cheek. His skin was warm, familiar, and for that moment, just that one perfect moment, the fairy tale still felt intact. I should have paid attention to Mark's face during the toast. Should have noticed how his jaw clenched tighter, how his knuckles went white around his glass, how his eyes never left David's face with an intensity that had nothing to do with celebration. But then Mark stood up and everything changed. His chair screeched against the marble floor, the harsh sound cutting through the music like fingernails on a chalkboard. The room fell silent so quickly you could hear the champagne bubbles fizzing in forgotten glasses, the soft whisper of silk as women turned to look, the subtle creak of men leaning forward in their chairs. His face was flushed, not from alcohol, but from something deeper. Something that had been building pressure like a volcano, waiting for exactly this moment to erupt. "You're a liar, David," Mark spat, his voice carrying across the silent ballroom with the force of a gunshot. The words hung in the air like smoke. My heart stopped completely for a beat, then started again with a painful lurch that made me dizzy. The champagne glass in my hand suddenly felt impossibly heavy, slippery with condensation and my own nervous sweat. David's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second, so quickly that anyone not watching closely might have missed it. But I was watching closely, had been watching him closely for months without realizing it, cataloging little inconsistencies and changes in his behavior that I'd been trying so hard to ignore. He recovered quickly, though, that practiced charm sliding back into place like armor. "Mark," he said through gritted teeth, his voice low and carefully controlled, the tone he used in board meetings when someone challenged his authority. "Sit down. You've had too much to drink." It was a masterful deflection. Blame the messenger, question his credibility, make everyone in the room focus on Mark's supposed drunkenness instead of the accusation itself. Classic David, always controlling the narrative, always managing the room. But Mark didn't sit. Instead, he stepped forward, pointing directly at my husband with a finger that trembled not from alcohol but from pure, unleashed fury. "Too much to drink?" "No, David. I've had too much of watching you parade around like some kind of saint while you sneak around behind your wife's back like a dog in heat." The collective gasp that went through that room, I'll never forget that sound. 200 people drawing breath simultaneously, the sound of a crowd realizing they were about to witness something explosive and intimate and probably devastating. Phones materialized from purses and jacket pockets like magic tricks. Within seconds, at least 50 devices were pointed in our direction, already recording, already capturing what would undoubtedly become the most talked about society scandal of the year. I felt my knees wobble, my grip on the champagne glass loosening until I had to concentrate on not dropping it. The room began to spin slightly at the edges, and I gripped the edge of the table with my free hand to steady myself. Whispers exploded like wildfire around us. I caught fragments. "Did he say? Is this really happening? Oh my God, look at her face." Every eye in the room turned to me, studying my expression, hungry for the drama about to unfold, waiting to see if I would collapse or explode or simply disappear. "Mark," David hissed, his composure cracking just enough for people to notice the desperation creeping into his voice. "Don't do this." But Mark was past the point of stopping. Whatever had been eating at him for months, whatever knowledge had been burning him up inside, was finally pouring out like acid. "Don't do what?" he barked back, louder now, playing to the crowd whether he intended to or not. "Tell the truth? Tell her about your late-night hotel meetings? Tell her about the woman you've been buying jewelry for while your wife sits at home making excuses for you. Hotel meetings. Jewelry purchases. The mysterious charges on our credit cards that David always had explanations for, business dinners that ran late, gifts for clients, rewards for himself after big deals closed. All of it suddenly clicked into place like pieces of a puzzle I'd been trying to solve without realizing it. My world tilted dangerously. The champagne bubbles in my glass seemed to slow down, each one rising through the golden liquid like it was moving through honey. The room began to spin more noticeably, and I had to focus on breathing. In through my nose, out through my mouth, to keep from hyperventilating right there in front of everyone. Every excuse David had given me over the past year suddenly made sickening sense. Every time I'd felt crazy for questioning him, every time he'd made me feel like I was being paranoid and insecure, every gut instinct I'd dismissed because I thought being a good wife meant trusting blindly, it had all been real. My suspicions had been justified. My instincts had been right all along. People at nearby tables leaned forward shamelessly, not even pretending they weren't listening. I caught sight of my mother-in-law's horrified expression, her hand pressed to her chest like she might have a heart attack. My sister stood frozen by the gift table, her mouth hanging open. Our business partners exchanged meaningful glances, probably already calculating how this scandal would affect their investments. David's face had gone pale, but he was still trying to control the situation, still trying to manage the narrative the way he managed everything else in his life. "He's drunk," he announced to the room, his voice shaking just enough for everyone to notice. "He's bitter, jealous. He's always wanted what I had." Another deflection, another attempt to make this about Mark's character instead of his own actions. Classic manipulation tactics. When caught, attack the credibility of your accuser, make yourself the victim, redirect the anger onto someone else. Mark laughed, a bitter sound that echoed off the high ceilings like breaking glass. "Always twisting the story, aren't you, David? Tell her the truth. Tell her who she's really sharing her bed with." The words hit me like physical blows. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, drowning out the whispers and gasps around us. Part of me wanted to scream, to demand details right then and there in front of everyone. Part of me wanted to run, to escape this nightmare before it got any worse. But mostly, I just stood there frozen, my carefully planned evening disintegrating around me like a sandcastle in a tsunami. The seconds stretched like hours. 200 people holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The orchestra had stopped playing entirely, their instruments silent. Even the waitstaff had frozen in place, champagne bottles suspended mid-pour, everyone transfixed by the drama unfolding in the center of the ballroom. David finally snapped. The careful control he'd maintained throughout his life, the smooth charm that had carried him through every crisis, finally cracked under the pressure. He slammed his hand against the table with enough force to make several glasses jump, champagne sloshing onto the white tablecloth like spilled blood. "Enough. This is her birthday, Mark. Her special day. You want to ruin it? Fine. But you won't ruin us." The desperation in his voice was unmistakable now. He wasn't just angry, he was terrified. Terrified of losing control, of being exposed, of having his carefully constructed image shattered in front of the very people whose respect and admiration he craved most. He turned to me then, grabbing my hands with desperate intensity. His palms were sweating, his fingers trembling slightly against mine. Up close, I could see the panic in his eyes, the calculation happening behind them as he tried to figure out how to salvage the situation. "Please," he begged, his voice cracking just enough for people to notice, just enough to seem genuine to anyone who didn't know him as well as I did. "Don't believe him. He's lying. There's no one else. There has never been anyone else." His eyes searched mine frantically, and for a moment that felt like an eternity, the room waited. 200 people suspended in anticipation, waiting to see if I would explode, throw my drink in his face, collapse in tears, or storm out in righteous fury. Everyone expected a scene. Expected drama. Expected the betrayed wife to fall apart or fight back or make a spectacle that would give them something to talk about for months. But I did none of those things. Instead, something strange happened. As I looked into his panicked eyes, really looked at him for maybe the first time in years, I saw something I'd never noticed before, the calculation. Even in his desperation, even while begging for forgiveness, he was performing. Working the room. Managing the situation. Trying to manipulate not just me, but everyone watching. And suddenly, I felt eerily calm. Like the eye of a hurricane, perfectly still while chaos swirled around me. I had a choice to make in that moment. I could play the role everyone expected, the devastated wife, the woman destroyed by her husband's betrayal. I could give them the dramatic scene they were all waiting for, complete with tears and accusations and righteous anger. Or I could do something else entirely. I smiled. Softly. almost imperceptibly. And then I nodded. "I believe you," I whispered, just loud enough for the front tables to hear. Relief flooded David's face like he'd just dodged a bullet. His shoulders sagged with gratitude, and he squeezed my hands like I'd just saved his life. The tension in the room loosened slightly, disappointment rippling through the crowd as they realized the drama was over. The show was ending without the climax they'd been anticipating. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure whether to be disappointed or relieved that the spectacle was concluding so anticlimactically. Some lowered their phones, others kept recording, hoping for a delayed reaction. Mark stared at me in disbelief for a long moment, his face cycling through confusion, disappointment, and finally disgust. He shook his head slowly, like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. "You're both pathetic," he muttered, his voice carrying just enough for the nearby tables to hear. Then he turned and stormed out of the ballroom, his footsteps echoing long after the doors swung shut behind him. The orchestra began playing again, tentatively at first, then with more confidence as conversations slowly resumed around us. The volume gradually increased as people processed what they'd witnessed and began sharing their reactions in hushed, excited tones. David wrapped his arms around me, pulling me close as if he'd won some great victory. His embrace felt different though, tighter, more desperate, like he was holding on to something he knew was slipping away. "Thank you," he whispered in my ear, his breath hot against my neck, relief making his voice shaky. "Thank you for trusting me. Thank you for not believing his lies." I kissed his cheek, playing the part of the loyal wife one final time. "Of course," I murmured back, my voice steady despite the earthquake happening inside me. "That's what wives do." But even as I said the words, even as I let him hold me and accept congratulations from guests who admired my grace under pressure, something fundamental had shifted inside me. I had seen the flicker of panic in his eyes before he'd managed to mask it with relief. I'd caught the hesitation in his denial, the way he deflected and attacked Mark's credibility instead of simply and emphatically denying the accusations outright. Mark might have been drunk, but drunk men don't usually fabricate such specific details. Hotel meetings, jewelry purchases. A mistress with enough reality to inspire this kind of rage from David's best friend. As the evening wore on and guests gradually forgot the disruption, as David charmed and joked and played the devoted husband, I found myself watching him with new eyes, noticing things I'd trained myself to ignore for years. The way he checked his phone compulsively, even during conversations with important clients. How his jaw tightened when certain names were mentioned in passing. The slight tells that had been there all along, waiting for me to stop making excuses and start paying attention. The way he touched the small of my back when introducing me to people, possessive rather than affectionate. How he answered questions about our future plans without consulting me, as if my opinions were assumptions rather than choices. The subtle ways he controlled conversations, redirecting attention to himself whenever someone showed too much interest in my work or accomplishments. I watched him work the room, and for the first time, I saw the performance for what it was. The calculated charm, the strategic compliments, the way he sized people up and adjusted his approach based on what he thought they wanted to hear. It was masterful, really. No wonder he'd been so successful in business. No wonder I'd fallen for it myself. But once you see the strings, you can never unsee them. I didn't know the full truth yet, but I knew enough. Enough to understand that Mark's accusations weren't the ravings of a jealous drunk. Enough to realize that my instincts, my suspicions, my growing sense that something was fundamentally wrong in my marriage, all of it had been accurate. I had been gaslighted so thoroughly that I'd stopped trusting my own perceptions. Made to feel paranoid for noticing inconsistencies, insecure for asking questions, demanding for expecting honesty. But standing there in that ballroom, watching David accept congratulations for weathering Mark's unfounded attacks, I finally understood what had been happening. I'd been living with a stranger. A very skilled, very dangerous stranger who'd been using my love and trust against me for God knew how long. So when the last guest finally left and we were alone in our bedroom, when David pulled me close and whispered, "I'm so glad that's over. Mark's been jealous of us for years, you know." I think he's always been in love with you himself. I simply nodded and let him believe he'd fooled me. But as he fell asleep beside me, confident in his performance, secure in the knowledge that he'd successfully managed yet another crisis, I stared at the ceiling and made myself a promise. I would never be blindsided again. If there really was another woman out there, if Mark's accusations were true, then David had no idea what was coming for him. Because the woman who'd been trained to ignore her instincts, to make excuses for inexcusable behavior, to prioritize his comfort over her own sanity, that woman was gone. And the woman who remained was going to find out exactly what her husband had been hiding. A year can stretch like a lifetime when you sleep beside someone you no longer trust. Outwardly, we remained the golden couple, shaking hands at galas, smiling in glossy magazines, playing hosts to partners who saw us as a model marriage. But behind closed doors, silence grew like mold in the corners of our house. Conversations ended half-finished. His apologies tasted hollow. My smiles became masks, painted on with the precision of survival. David seemed convinced the storm had passed. That because I had stood by him in public, because I had whispered, "I believe you," in front of 200 witnesses, the matter was buried. He returned to his old rhythms, late nights, business trips, phone calls that ended the moment I entered the room. If anything, he grew bolder, as if my silence was proof of his invincibility. But silence does not mean ignorance. And loyalty does not mean blindness. That year, I began my education in truth. I stopped arguing and started recording. When he said he was working late, I didn't confront, I verified. Hotel reservations at places far more luxurious than any meeting required. Jewelry purchases that never made it home, always delivered to unfamiliar addresses. Dinners for two at restaurants too intimate to be business. My stomach twisted, but my mind sharpened. Every receipt, every calendar discrepancy, every excuse became a piece of evidence. And in the background of all those records, one name echoed again and again: Victoria Sterling. His boss. His so-called partner. Elegant, ruthless, powerful. She controlled contracts worth millions, and David orbited her like a satellite. The papers called her his business ally. I knew better. By the time our wedding anniversary arrived, my hope was gone. What remained was resolve. He thought I was waiting in ignorance. In truth, I was building a fortress. I suggested we celebrate. Let's host something beautiful, I told him. Show everyone that we're stronger than ever. He agreed instantly, blind to the trap in my words. For him, appearances were oxygen. For me, this anniversary would be the airless room where he finally suffocated. The ballroom glittered again, but differently. At my birthday, I had wanted magic. Tonight, I wanted clarity. Friends and family filled the room, investors too, and in the far corner, dressed in crimson silk, stood Victoria. She accepted her invitation with the arrogance of someone who believed she had already won. I wore a gown the color of moonlight, satin that pooled like water when I moved. Around my wrist sparkled the bracelet David had given me long ago, back when I mistook his gifts for devotion. In my hands, I carried two things: a gold-wrapped box to play my role and a slim black folder that held the real script of the night. The room hummed with conversation, clinking glasses, laughter. But then the hush came. Conversations faded. Heads turned toward the center. David stood there, his smile stretched thin, nerves flickering beneath. And then, in a moment so grotesque it almost felt like theater, he dropped to one knee. For half a heartbeat, my chest filled with foolish hope. Was this a vow renewal? A gesture to reclaim what he had broken? My pulse surged with the possibility. The crowd leaned forward, phones already raised to record what they believed would be a declaration of love. But then I saw his eyes. They weren't on me. They were fixed on her. Victoria. The room tilted. "I choose you," he said. "Over everything. Over everyone." A collective gasp tore through the ballroom. A glass shattered somewhere, sharp and final. Victoria pressed her hand to her chest, shock painted across her face. Guests turned toward me, hungry for the spectacle of my collapse. I did not collapse. I did not cry. I did not scream. I smiled. Slowly. Calmly. The kind of smile that unsettles because it hides a storm. I set my gift on the table, straightened my shoulders, took a sip of champagne as though none of this mattered. Then, with deliberate grace, I reached for the folder. "David," I said softly, though my voice carried like a bell, "you've made your choice." He smirked, still kneeling, drunk on his own drama. He didn't see what was in my hands. And so have I. I opened the folder. Under the chandelier light, the seals gleamed, the signatures danced. "These are the transfer documents," I announced. "Every share, every percentage, every asset of our $350 million company belongs to me now." The silence shattered like glass. Gasps rose. Phones flashed. His smirk died. "You can't," he stammered, scrambling to his feet. "I can," I said, stepping back as he lunged. And I did. "While you wasted yourself on lies, I made sure I wouldn't leave empty-handed. Keep your mistress. Keep your pride. But the empire? That's mine." Then, suddenly, the chandeliers went dark. The room plunged into blackness. Gasps. Shouts. The clatter of a glass breaking. My pulse thundered. In the darkness, someone brushed against me. A woman's breath seared my ear. "He was planning to frame you," the whisper came. "All of it. The fraud, the embezzlement. He was going to pin it on you." And then, just as quickly, the lights snapped back on. When the lights flickered back on, the air felt different, charged, electric, poisonous. For a moment, the room was caught between chaos and silence. Guests blinked against the sudden brightness, phones raised higher, their screens reflecting wide eyes and pale faces. My fingers tightened around the folder in my hands, my anchor in the storm. And then I saw her. She pushed through the parting crowd like a flame tearing through dry paper. Crimson silk clung to her frame, her heels struck the marble with fury, and her eyes locked on David like she had rehearsed this moment in her nightmares. His mistress. The faceless rumor I had swallowed for months now had a face, beautiful, angry, trembling with betrayal and pride. "David," she spat, her voice slicing the air. "Are you really going to do this? Here? In front of her?" The room rippled with gasps. Heads turned like sunflowers, following every word. Phones tilted higher, lenses greedy for each second of humiliation. My stomach clenched, but I held still. I had promised myself I would not give anyone the spectacle they craved. David's jaw slackened, his lips parting without sound. For once, he had no script. The boss, the woman he had just proposed to, took a cautious step back, her crimson lips stiff with disgust. The triangle was clear now: husband, mistress, boss. 3 points of betrayal, intersecting in the ugliest geometry of my life. The mistress's voice cracked, but her rage burned through. "Tell them," she demanded, pointing at him with shaking fingers. "Tell them who you've been sneaking off to at night. Tell them who you've really been with." The boss's eyes sharpened. "What is she talking about, David?" Her voice trembled with equal parts fury and fear. David's chest rose and fell, sweat glistening under the chandelier light. He glanced at me, just a flicker, and then back at the woman in crimson. And then, like a dam breaking, he shouted, "I love her." The words thundered through the room. A collective gasp erupted, people clutching pearls, covering mouths, whispering too loudly to hide. I stood frozen, my face still calm, though my heart hammered against my ribs. It wasn't shock that held me, it was confirmation. I had known. I had suspected. Now the whole world knew. The mistress's expression shifted: pain, triumph, despair, all tangled into one. For her, it wasn't victory. It was exposure. And then another figure moved forward from the crowd. She was younger, her resemblance to the mistress undeniable. Same sharp jaw, same eyes, but steadier, colder. Her heels clicked with composure, not rage, as she stepped into the circle of judgment. Her voice, when it came, was smooth as glass, but sharp enough to draw blood. "You think this is about love?" she said. "It isn't. My sister wasn't his endgame. She was his cover." The room shifted again, attention snapping to her. My pulse quickened. David's head jerked toward her. "Shut up," he hissed, the mask of charm gone, desperation bleeding through. She didn't flinch. She looked directly at me. He told her everything. He planned to drain your accounts, every cent offshore transfers already in motion. Fake names. Flights booked. He wasn't going to stay with her. He wasn't going to stay with you. He was going to disappear and leave you with nothing but the debts and the blame. A murmur swept through the guests like wildfire. Phones trembled in eager hands, capturing every syllable. My throat tightened. Betrayal was one thing, calculated conspiracy was another. He hadn't just wanted someone else. He had wanted my ruin. David lunged forward, face red, spit flying from his mouth. She's lying, he roared. She's jealous, she doesn't know anything. But his mistress didn't deny it. She stood frozen, eyes darting away, her silence speaking louder than words. In that silence, the truth crystallized. I hadn't just been betrayed. I had been hunted, targeted. My marriage had been his stage, my love his alibi, my trust his weapon. And still I didn't break. Because while he was planning, I had been preparing. The silence after her words was suffocating. You could feel the weight of 200 eyes pressing into my skin, trying to decide if they were witnessing tragedy, scandal, or the opening act of something darker. My ears rang with her voice. He was going to drain your accounts. He was going to leave you with nothing. David's face twisted into something feral, something unrecognizable. The mask of charm he'd worn for years had cracked in front of everyone, and what leaked through was rage. She's lying, he shouted, his voice hoarse, desperate. She doesn't know anything. She's jealous, jealous of you, jealous of us. But the mistress didn't speak. She just stood there, trembling, her silence confessing more than her lips ever could. Her crimson dress clung to her frame like a wound. The crowd leaned in, greedy for each flicker of pain, each revelation that stripped away the illusion of control. Then the sound came. Sirens. Faint at first, then swelling, slicing through the muffled air of the ballroom. Red and blue lights began to pulse against the tall windows, flickering across white walls, across jeweled necks and shocked faces. The crowd erupted. Some whispered in frantic tones, others moved toward the windows, their curiosity stronger than their shame. I stayed rooted, folders still clutched in my hands, my breath steady. And then the doors burst open. Uniformed officers stormed inside, boots heavy against marble, radios crackling. Conversations died mid-sentence. Trays slipped from trembling hands. Champagne splashed across the floor like wasted celebration. David Matthews, one officer barked, his tone sharp enough to cut the silence. You are under arrest for fraud and embezzlement. Don't move. Gasps broke across the room like dominoes. My husband, my betrayer, stood frozen at the center of the storm, his complexion drained to chalk. This is a mistake, he stammered. You don't understand, I'm the victim here. His voice cracked, flailing between outrage and fear. But the officers moved with precision, their faces blank, their training impenetrable. Don't make this harder than it needs to be, another warned. David's eyes darted wildly around the room, scanning for an ally, for an escape. And then he found her. The mistress. He lunged, his hand clamping around her wrist with pathetic desperation. Run with me, he hissed, his voice breaking. We can get out of here before they please. You know I love you. It's always been you. But she pulled away, her voice sharp enough to shatter him. You lied to me, she spat, her chest heaving. Everything was lies. You promised me a future, and all you built was destruction. Her voice trembled, but didn't falter. You're not a man. You're a fraud. David's mouth worked soundlessly as her rejection landed. For the first time in years, he looked small, less like a titan, more like a boy caught stealing from the cookie jar. Pathetic. Cornered. Two officers seized him by the arms. The metallic click of handcuffs echoed through the ballroom like the strike of a gavel. Final. Irrevocable. David thrashed, his voice shrill now, ragged with panic. She set me up. His eyes found mine, wild, bloodshot. It's her. She turned everyone against me. She's the reason for this. She's behind it all. Every phone camera swung toward me. The crowd waited, hungry for my collapse, for guilt, for shame. But I did not flinch. This was no setup. This was consequence. I stood tall as he spat curses as his voice cracked against the walls. He was dragged, powerless, through the doors and into the flashing night, leaving only echoes of fury behind him. His empire, his lies, his mask, all gone. And yet, even as the doors swung shut, I felt a presence at my side. The mistress's sister again. She leaned close, her whisper threading into my ear like a warning only meant for me. "You're not safe yet. He was planning to frame you." My chest tightened. Her words fell heavy, undeniable. The room buzzed with aftershocks, guests whispering, recording, piecing together their own versions of the story. But I barely heard them. My mind locked on her words, echoing louder than the sirens outside. This wasn't the end. This was only the beginning. The doors closed behind David, but the ballroom didn't breathe. For a long moment, everyone remained frozen, eyes wide, phones still lifted. His curses still echoed faintly in my ears, his voice raw with desperation, as though he could claw back what was already gone. Then the whispers began. First in cautious hisses, then in a rising swell, like bees swarming after a hive has been struck. People traded fragments of the story, piecing together their own versions. Some stared at me with pity, others with awe, many with the hungry curiosity of witnesses who knew they'd have gossip to feed on for months. I stood in the center of it all, the black folder still pressed to my chest. My anchor, my protection, my shield. The mistress was gone, led away by her sister, their silhouettes vanishing into the chaos. The boss, his other woman, the one he had humiliated me for, remained at the edge of the room, arms crossed tight, her face chalk white. She had built her empire on control, and yet in that moment, she looked like a spectator who had bet on the wrong horse. I let the silence stretch, then drew in a steady breath. My heels clicked against the marble as I walked forward, slow and deliberate. 200 heads turned. Conversations choked off. Tonight, I said, my voice carrying cleanly across the room, was not the celebration I planned. No one moved. The chandeliers hummed above me, their crystals trembling faintly as though the building itself held its breath. But it is the closure I needed. My words surprised even me. Not revenge. Not triumph. Closure. Because endings do not always come with applause, they sometimes come with silence. And that silence, heavy and steady, was enough. I let my eyes sweep the room, friends, enemies, rivals, neighbors, all of them gathered here to toast a love story that had just collapsed before their eyes. They had come for champagne and speeches, for a polished picture. Instead, they had been given the truth, a man's lies, a mistress's rage, a conspiracy unveiled like blood under bright light. I didn't offer them more. No tears. No outburst. I simply lifted the folder, pressed it once more against my chest, and walked toward the doors. The crowd parted as though I were a flame and they were dry grass. Some stepped aside in respect, others in fear. A few in shame, unwilling to meet my eyes. Outside, the night air hit me like baptism, cool, sharp, cleansing. Police cars still painted the street in restless red and blue. Officers spoke into radios. Journalists pushed forward with cameras, neighbors craned from their windows. But I walked through it all with my head high, each step steady. Somewhere behind me, muffled by doors and sirens, David screamed my name. But his voice no longer mattered. At the edge of the street, I paused not to look back, but to breathe. To let the cold air fill my lungs, to feel the weight of freedom settle where the weight of suspicion had lived for so long. He thought he ended me, I whispered into the night. But tonight, I ended us and saved myself. And then I stepped forward into my own future. Not as his wife. Not as his victim. But as myself, whole, unbroken, free. Court dealt with the legal side of David's downfall. But I wanted more than verdicts and handcuffs. I wanted truth, undeniable and permanent, carved into the world so that he could never hide behind charm again. At home, I opened a drawer I hadn't touched in years. Inside was my insurance, a dossier of everything he thought I would never notice. Receipts, messages, hotel invoices, photographs, whispers from people he wronged. Each page a thread of a web he thought invisible. And on top of that stack lay a letter I had written months earlier, back when despair had been my companion. It began simply, "To the man who thought I was replaceable." I reread my own words. The night I begged him to see me, and he turned away. The mistress he paraded while I was blamed for being weak. The years of manipulation wrapped in charm. The empire built on deceit and destined to crumble under its own weight. Line by line, the letter was both confession and verdict, the story of a marriage rotting from the inside. By dawn, I sealed copies of the letter with the evidence and addressed them. His clients. His associates. The clubs and boards he once boasted about. Each envelope landed in the mailbox with the heavy sound of finality. But I didn't stop there. The world deserved to know. So with trembling fingers, I posted it online. An open letter. A truth too sharp to bury. By noon, it spread like wildfire. People read, reposted, dissected. They didn't just see my pain, they saw proof. They saw the receipts. They saw how his empire had been a house of cards, propped up by deceit. His name trended, not as a titan but as a cautionary tale. The fallout was brutal. His company severed ties. His friends blocked his number. Even his family issued statements, hurried and cold, distancing themselves from the scandal. He had lost more than money or freedom. He had lost the mask he valued above all, respectability. And me? For the first time in years, I walked through town with my head high. Neighbors stopped me, not with pity, but with recognition. They had read my words. They knew the truth. For once, I was not invisible. I was undeniable. That night, I sat by the window as dusk fell. The letter lay in front of me, the last copy signed with my hand. I whispered the final lines aloud, like a prayer answered by my own voice. You tried to bury me in silence, David. But my voice was the one thing you couldn't take. And it was my voice that destroyed you. The world had turned my pain into consequence. He tried to steal my life. Instead, I reclaimed something greater, my story, my dignity, my freedom. This was not just the end of him. It was the beginning of me. If this story gripped you, don't leave yet. Subscribe for more episodes where truth, betrayal, and survival collide. And don't forget to like and share, because you never know who needs to hear that freedom is possible.